The Great Famine of year 1315 to 1317, Europe. The early 14th century marked one of Europe's most grueling periods of starvation and hardship, known as the Great Famine. For 2 devastating years, relentless rains pounded across northern Europe, disrupting farming and destroying crop yields that supported millions. Europe's feudal agricultural system, heavily reliant on annual harvests and communal storage, was ill-prepared for such prolonged, unseasonal rainfall. This famine was particularly destructive because it followed a century of population growth and relative stability, which had made Europe's population more vulnerable to food shortages. With heavy rains preventing crops from maturing, the usual grain supply dwindled, causing food prices to soar overnight. Communities that had relied on reserves or trade suddenly faced scarcity on an unprecedented scale. Starvation became widespread, leading to desperation as communities tried to survive on what little was available, sometimes turning to wild plants, bark, and even animals typically avoided for food. The famine was more than a physical hardship. It had profound psychological and societal effects. Reports of cannibalism and looting spread across regions, and social order began to break down under the strain of survival. The weakened population, suffering from malnutrition, became susceptible to disease, setting the stage for future epidemics. Indeed, when the Black Death struck Europe in 1347, the weakened, malnourished populace was even more vulnerable, exacerbating the plague's impact. The Great Famine, then, was a grim foreshadowing of how environmental calamities could unravel societies, exposing the vulnerabilities of a fragile agrarian economy and leaving scars that would impact generations. The Chalisa famine year, 1783 to 1784, India. In India, famine was not uncommon in the 18th century, but the Chalisa famine, spanning 1783 to 1784, was especially severe. Named after the Hindu year Chalisa, which corresponds to the famine's onset, this calamity struck during the decline of the Mughal Empire, a period of political fragmentation and economic instability. Northern India, a region already struggling with poor agricultural yields and social unrest, found itself caught in the throes of a devastating drought that compounded these issues. The drought disrupted the critical monsoon rains upon which much of Indian agriculture depended. Without sufficient rainfall, crops withered, wells dried up, and livestock perished. The agrarian economy of northern India, deeply reliant on seasonal cycles and lacking substantial food reserves, was unprepared for such a blow. Local rulers and Mughal authorities struggled to organize effective relief, hampered by poor infrastructure and political instability. The British East India Company, expanding its influence at this time, had not yet established robust relief systems or food distribution networks, leaving millions at the mercy of natural forces. Estimates suggest that the Chalisa famine led to the deaths of around 11 million people across northern India, as entire communities perished without access to food or water. The social and economic impacts were profound: depopulated villages, disrupted trade, and a weakened labor force that would take years to recover. The famine starkly revealed the weaknesses in food security and governance in the region, highlighting India's reliance on monsoon rains and the need for better famine response systems. In later years, British colonial rule would attempt to address some of these vulnerabilities, though often with mixed results and controversial policies. The Chalisa famine thus underscored the precariousness of life in a monsoon-dependent agrarian society, where the absence of rain could spell disaster on a massive scale. The Irish potato famine year, 1845 to 1852. In the mid-19th century, Ireland was devastated by one of the most infamous famines in history, the Irish potato famine. For centuries, potatoes had been a staple crop in Ireland, particularly for the impoverished tenant farmers who depended on this single crop for sustenance. When potato blight struck in 1845, a disease that rots the plant from within, it spelled disaster for the Irish, especially since tenant farmers lacked the means to diversify their crops or seek alternative livelihoods. The situation was aggravated by British colonial policies that favored landowners and exports over local food security. While the Irish starved, food continued to be exported from Ireland to Britain, as the colonial government maintained strict adherence to market principles, refusing to intervene significantly in food distribution. This lack of action was further fueled by prevailing beliefs in laissez-faire economics, where government interference in markets was seen as counterproductive. For many, the British government's reluctance to provide relief became a symbol of oppression, deepening the resentment that already existed due to centuries of colonial rule. The famine's death toll is estimated to be over 1 million, with another million forced to emigrate, often in dire conditions, to the United States, Canada, and Australia. This mass emigration, combined with the famine's death toll, drastically reduced Ireland's population and altered its demographic landscape. The Irish potato famine became a turning point in Irish history, fueling nationalism and anti-British sentiment that would culminate in later independence movements. The memory of the famine remained a painful reminder of the failures of colonial governance, with its scars visible not just in population loss but in the cultural consciousness of Ireland itself. The Great Chinese Famine, year 1959 to 1961. The Great Chinese Famine of 1959 to 1961 was among the deadliest famines in human history, with death estimates ranging from 15 to 45 million people. Unlike previous famines driven primarily by environmental factors, this catastrophe was largely a result of political mismanagement under the leadership of Mao Zedong. In 1958, Mao launched the Great Leap Forward, an ambitious plan to rapidly industrialize China and collectivize its agriculture. The plan aimed to transform China into a modern industrial power, but its implementation disrupted traditional farming practices, dismantled food distribution systems, and caused widespread chaos in the rural economy. The shift to collective farming, where individual land ownership was abolished, meant that farmers no longer had control over their produce. Unrealistic production quotas were imposed, leading to false reports of crop yields that painted a picture of abundance while people starved. In many cases, local officials, fearing punishment, exaggerated crop yields to please the central government. The surplus reported was thus an illusion, masking the famine that was sweeping the countryside. The famine's impact was devastating. Rural areas bore the brunt, with families losing loved ones to starvation and malnutrition-related diseases. The toll was not just physical but also psychological, as communities were left traumatized, with survivors haunted by memories of loss and suffering. Internationally, the famine remained hidden for years due to government secrecy, but its scale would eventually come to light, marking one of the darkest periods in Chinese history. The Great Chinese Famine serves as a stark example of how political ideology, when prioritized over practical agricultural management, can lead to devastating consequences for ordinary people. The Bengal Famine year, 1943, British India. The Bengal Famine of 1943 was a tragedy that struck at the height of World War II and remains one of the most controversial episodes in British colonial history. British India was deeply affected by the war, with resources directed towards the military effort, and Bengal was particularly vulnerable due to its dependence on rice, a crop sensitive to both environmental factors and market disruptions. A series of factors converged to create the perfect storm: wartime inflation, crop disease, and cyclone-induced flooding that reduced local food availability. However, beyond natural factors, colonial policies played a significant role in worsening the famine. British authorities implemented a scorched earth policy in Bengal to prevent Japanese forces from using resources if they invaded. This policy included the confiscation of boats and the destruction of rice stores in coastal areas, leaving rural communities isolated and without essential supplies. Additionally, the British government continued exporting rice from India to support the war, even as local populations struggled to find food. Despite appeals for aid, British Prime Minister Winston Churchill reportedly dismissed the situation, viewing it as an unfortunate but necessary sacrifice for the war effort. The Bengal famine claimed the lives of an estimated 2 to 3 million people, mostly from starvation and malnutrition-related diseases. The tragedy deepened the rift between the British authorities and Indian society, sparking anger and fueling anti-colonial sentiment. For many Indians, the famine represented the worst of colonial indifference, a betrayal that ultimately strengthened calls for independence. When India gained its freedom in 1947, memories of the Bengal famine lingered, influencing post-independence policies on food security and emergency preparedness. The famine remains a painful reminder of the impact that political and military priorities can have on vulnerable populations, especially under colonial rule. The Ethiopian famine, year 1983 to 1985. The Ethiopian famine of the 1980s, widely televised and seared into global consciousness, serves as a haunting example of how drought and political turmoil can combine to create a humanitarian crisis. Beginning in 1983, Ethiopia faced a severe drought in the northern regions of Tigray and Wollo, areas already struggling due to years of economic hardship and conflict. However, the Ethiopian government, led by the Marxist-Leninist Derg regime, worsened the situation through policies that prioritized military spending over public welfare, even as the famine unfolded. The government's war against separatist rebels in the north consumed vast resources, diverting aid and food from famine-stricken areas. Additionally, the Derg implemented forced resettlement programs, moving people from drought-affected regions to southern areas in the hope of better agricultural opportunities. These relocations, however, were poorly managed, and many people died during the arduous journeys or arrived at relocation sites with insufficient support. The famine gained international attention in 1984 as images of emaciated children and suffering families flooded Western media. This exposure prompted a massive global response, with campaigns like Band-Aid and Live Aid, led by musicians Bob Geldof and Midge Ure, raising millions of dollars for relief. These initiatives marked a turning point in global humanitarian efforts, mobilizing people worldwide to provide aid to famine victims. Despite this outpouring of aid, the Ethiopian government's restrictive policies and mismanagement meant that relief efforts were often hampered. The famine ultimately claimed an estimated 1 million lives and left deep scars on Ethiopian society, while simultaneously redefining international responses to humanitarian crises. The Ethiopian famine underscored the need for proactive, politically sensitive approaches to famine relief, as well as a commitment to addressing root causes such as poverty and conflict. The North Korean famine, year 1994 to 1998. In the mid-1990s, North Korea suffered a devastating famine, euphemistically referred to within the country as the Arduous March. Unlike previous famines driven by colonial or wartime contexts, the North Korean famine was largely due to the country's economic isolation, compounded by political mismanagement and environmental hardship. After the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991, North Korea lost a major trading partner and source of subsidized food and fuel. This sudden economic shift left the country unable to support its agricultural sector or import essential goods. At the same time, North Korea experienced severe flooding in 1995 and 1996, which further reduced crop yields. The government's response to the crisis was limited, with rigid policies that restricted movement and blocked information about the famine from reaching the international community. The population, reliant on state-controlled food distribution, was left to cope with acute food shortages, leading to widespread starvation. Estimates suggest that between 600,000 and 2 million people died from malnutrition-related causes during this period. International aid organizations attempted to assist North Korea, but the regime's secrecy and strict controls made it challenging to provide effective relief. Food donations were often funneled to loyalists and the military, leaving vulnerable populations, especially in rural areas, without adequate support. The famine highlighted the difficulty of delivering humanitarian aid within highly restrictive regimes and underscored the risks of economic isolation. To this day, North Korea's government tightly controls information, making it difficult to assess the full impact of the famine. The tragedy remains a sobering reminder of how political isolation and authoritarian governance can amplify natural and economic crises, leaving populations without the support they desperately need. The Somalia famine year 2011 to 2012. The Somalia famine of 2011 to 2012 was one of the first major famines of the 21st century, highlighting the complex interplay between climate change, conflict, and humanitarian aid. A severe drought struck the Horn of Africa in 2010, affecting Somalia, Ethiopia, and Kenya. Somalia, however, was especially vulnerable, as decades of civil war and the presence of militant groups like al-Shabaab had already destabilized the region, making it difficult for aid organizations to reach those in need. In 2011, after consecutive failed rainy seasons, food insecurity reached critical levels in southern Somalia, an area controlled by al-Shabaab. The militant group not only blocked humanitarian aid from Western countries, but also imposed heavy taxes on local farmers, further exacerbating food scarcity. By July 2011, the United Nations officially declared a famine in parts of Somalia, estimating that 250,000 people, many of them children, had died from malnutrition-related causes. The international response, while swift, faced significant challenges. Humanitarian organizations struggled to navigate the dangerous political landscape, and the Somali government lacked the infrastructure to support widespread relief efforts. The famine spurred global conversations about food security and the need for climate-resilient agricultural practices, particularly in regions susceptible to both drought and conflict. It also underscored the importance of conflict-sensitive humanitarian responses, as efforts to reach affected populations were often hampered by ongoing violence and political instability. The Somali famine remains a powerful reminder of the devastating impact that climate change, when combined with conflict, can have on vulnerable populations, and the importance of international cooperation in crisis prevention and response. The Yemen famine 2016, to present Yemen's ongoing humanitarian crisis, represents one of the 21st century's most prolonged famines, resulting from a devastating combination of conflict, political instability, and economic collapse. Since the outbreak of civil war in 2015, Yemen's infrastructure has been decimated, with basic services collapsing. The involvement of multiple factions, including Houthi rebels, the Yemeni government, and external influences from Saudi Arabia and Iran, has left Yemen's infrastructure in ruins and essential resources like food, water, and healthcare inaccessible. Yemen's reliance on food imports, nearly 90% of its food supply, has made the population highly vulnerable, especially given the naval blockade imposed by the Saudi-led coalition, which restricts essential imports. As food prices have surged, millions of Yemenis face chronic food insecurity and severe malnutrition, with over 17 million people currently at risk. Aid organizations, including UNICEF and the World Food Program, have made significant efforts to deliver assistance, but the ongoing conflict severely limits access to those most in need. Yemen's famine starkly illustrates how political and military conflicts exacerbate natural vulnerabilities, leaving populations suffering despite international awareness and attempts at intervention. The South Sudan famine, 2017. In early 2017, the United Nations declared a famine in parts of South Sudan, marking the first officially recognized famine in 6 years. The country's young population had been grappling with food insecurity since gaining independence in 2011, but civil war, displacement, and economic instability worsened the crisis. South Sudan's dependence on subsistence agriculture, combined with the destruction of farms, markets, and supply routes due to conflict, left many regions without access to food. The famine in South Sudan was exacerbated by inflation, as food prices soared beyond the reach of most citizens. Displaced families, fleeing violence, often found themselves in camps with inadequate resources. The famine prompted an international response, with organizations like the UN and various NGOs working to provide emergency food supplies. Despite these efforts, continued violence and limited infrastructure have left millions in South Sudan struggling with hunger, underscoring the challenge of delivering aid in conflict zones. This famine reflects the tragic reality that even newly independent nations can quickly face humanitarian crises when conflict and economic challenges collide. What are your thoughts on this? Let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel for the latest tech news. Thanks for sticking around, and I catch you in the next one.